I was halfway through bolting the third solar panel onto the roof of my off-grid cabin when the sirens started howling up the gravel road. I froze, drill still in hand, sweat dripping from my brow. The wind rustled the pines behind me as a county sheriff cruiser skidded to a stop near my truck. Two deputies stepped out, hands hovering near their belts like I was robbing my own land. "You Oscar?" one of them asked, scanning the open toolboxes and panels stacked against the porch. "Yeah," I said, climbing down the ladder slowly. "Oscar Tillman." "What's going on?" "We got a 911 call reporting unauthorized construction and possible code violations," the deputy said. "Caller claimed you were illegally installing solar panels. I didn't even have to guess who it was." Right on cue, a silver Lexus crept up the road, tires crunching on gravel like nails on a chalkboard. Out stepped Arlene Ashford, vice president of the Briar Hills HOA, self-appointed enforcer of everything from lawn length to mailbox color. She stormed over in wedge heels, completely unsuited for the woods. "I told you," she waved at the deputies, pointing a manicured finger at my cabin. "He's breaking the law. That roof is visible from the trailhead and those panels are an eyesore. This entire development has aesthetic guidelines." The deputy looked at me confused. "Is this a private HOA?" "She thinks it is," I said calmly. "But this cabin is on my 5-acre parcel outside the HOA boundary, always has been." "Arlene here just doesn't like that I'm not under her little thumb." Arlene's face turned red. "Don't lie. The community map clearly shows your property within the jurisdiction. I have copies." I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the PDF I always kept on hand, and handed it to the deputy. "That's the actual zoning map filed with the county. My land was excluded when the HOA was formed back in '08. I wrote the zoning code myself when I was on the county planning board. You can call the office to confirm." The deputy glanced at the map, then looked over at Arlene. "Ma'am, if this is accurate, he's not in your jurisdiction. And installing solar panels on private rural land isn't a crime." Arlene looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. "He's ruining the visual harmony of our community. That cabin is visible from the ridge. So's the water tower and your pink patio umbrellas," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Difference is, mine's legal." She turned to the deputies, voice rising. "Then cite him for not having a permit. You can't just build things without one." I pulled a laminated paper from the truck cab and handed it over. "Signed and approved by the county, permit numbers right there. Full plan specs attached." The deputy gave a short nod. "Looks in order." Arlene's eyes narrowed like she was trying to melt me with sheer rage. "You smug little..." "Careful," I said, cutting her off. "You just called 911 over a non-emergency. That's misuse of emergency services." That got the deputy's attention. One of them asked, "Did you tell dispatch there was illegal activity and trespassing?" "Yes," she snapped. "Because he's building without authorization," the younger deputy sighed. "Ma'am, that's not a 911 matter. That's a civil issue, if anything. False reports waste county resources. We'll be filing a report." Arlene's mouth opened, then shut. She turned and stormed back to her Lexus, muttering something about calling the board. As the cruiser pulled away, the older deputy shot me a look. "You really wrote that zoning code?" "Yep," I said, climbing back up the ladder. "And it's about to come in real handy." 3 mornings later, I was stacking reclaimed cedar planks for the rain catchment shed when I noticed a white SUV parked just past the tree line. It wasn't a neighbor's, it had government plates and a logo stenciled on the door. A woman in a navy windbreaker was scribbling something on a clipboard while pacing the edge of my property. I walked over slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Can I help you with something?" She looked up, expression unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. "You Oscar Tillman?" "Yeah," Danielle Reyes, Code Enforcement, County Planning Division. "Got a call from the Briar Hills HOA about unpermitted structures and environmental violations. Wanted to see for myself before wasting anyone's time." I raised an eyebrow. "Environmental violations." She flipped the clipboard around and pointed to a highlighted section on a photocopied complaint. "Claimed you were diverting runoff, clearing protected vegetation, and constructing beyond the allowable footprint." I exhaled sharply, trying to keep my temper in check. "None of that's true." I've got erosion control mats in place, flagged every tree before clearing, and the cabin footprint hasn't changed since the original permit in 2019. You want to see the site plan? She nodded. I do. 10 minutes later, we were in my cabin, blueprints rolled out across the dining table. Danielle traced her finger down the margin, checking annotations against the GPS coordinates on her tablet. You mapped this yourself? I did. Used LiDAR overlays from the county GIS. Every stake out there matches the registered corners. She let out a low whistle. You weren't kidding. This is cleaner than most of the contractors I deal with. Appreciate that. So what now? She looked toward the window where the new solar panels gleamed in the sun. Now I file a report saying you're in full compliance, but I'll need to document the inspection. Mind if I take some photos? Knock yourself out. As she stepped outside, I spotted a movement across the ridge. Arlene, again, crouched beside a decorative boulder like a raccoon in church pearls. She was holding her phone up, clearly filming us. Danielle noticed it too. Is that who filed the complaint? Yep, she's been trying every angle to force me under their HOA umbrella. Danielle narrowed her eyes. She's wasting public resources and filing fraudulent claims. That's actionable. I was hoping you'd say that. The next afternoon, I drove into town, parked in front of the county records office, and headed straight for an old colleague, Marty Keene, now head of zoning enforcement. His office hadn't changed much since we worked together a decade ago, except now he had more gray in his beard and a coffee mug that read, "No, you can't build that." He waved me in before I knocked. Heard you've got a war brewing with Briar Hills. They're escalating. Arlene filed a false environmental complaint. Danielle cleared me, but that's the third bogus report in a month. She's trying to build a paper trail. Trying to force annexation through nuisance tactics, he asked, leaning back in his chair. Exactly. She's banking on me folding or selling. Marty cracked his knuckles. I've got something for you. We found an addendum from '08 buried in the charter filings. Turns out Briar Hills tried to amend their boundary lines. Let me guess, they never recorded it with the county. Bingo. The plat map they're using to claim jurisdiction over your land, completely useless. They never filed the legal survey. I leaned forward. So they're enforcing a boundary that doesn't exist. Worse, Marty said, pulling a manila folder from a drawer. They've been collecting dues and issuing citations to properties they technically have no legal control over. That's fraudulent governance. My eyes widened. How many properties? 7, including yours. 4 of them have paid fines. One family sold their place after being threatened with lien proceedings. That changed the game. This wasn't just Arlene harassing me. This was systemic overreach, possibly criminal. Marty handed me photocopies of the original boundary filings and the incomplete amendment. You bring this to the district attorney and I'll back you up. Code enforcement's already suspicious. With Danielle's report, you've got a paper trail. The DA's office was 2 blocks away. I didn't even have to wait. I knew the assistant DA, Valerie Cheng, from my days on the planning board. She was meticulous, sharp, and allergic to bureaucracy games. She listened as I laid everything out, flipping through the records with growing interest. They've been collecting dues outside their legal boundary, she said slowly. That's unauthorized taxation. And if they threatened liens, that's extortion. I've got names of the folks they hit. One couple moved out last spring because Arlene kept citing them for imaginary violations. Valerie tapped her pen on the desk. We can open a fraud inquiry. But I'll need sworn statements from at least 2 affected property owners. Think you can get them? I know exactly who to ask. Back at the cabin, I grabbed my binder of neighborhood contacts. I reached out to Greg and Shelley Ross, first retired school teachers who'd lived near the ridge before Arlene's harassment campaign drove them to list their property. They were still in town, renting a condo while house hunting. When I told them what I'd uncovered, Greg's jaw set in a way I hadn't seen since his days on the school board. She threatened to fine us $500 a day for having a clothes line, Shelley said. We thought we had no choice. You were never under their authority, I said. And we're going to prove it. They agreed to give sworn statements. 2 days later, Valerie filed a preliminary complaint in county court naming Briar Hills HOA and its board of directors in a civil fraud investigation. That same evening, a plainclothes investigator visited Arlene's home. I wasn't there, but Greg was. He'd gone for a walk and saw the whole thing. Arlene answered the door in silk pajamas, tried to brush the man off, and then turned deathly pale when he showed his badge and handed her a summons. The fallout began within 24 hours. A notice went out to all Briar Hills residents informing them of the investigation. The county froze the HOA's ability to collect dues or issue fines pending the outcome. Arlene called an emergency board meeting, but only 2 members showed up, and one of them resigned on the spot. A week later, I was in my cabin finishing up the last row of cedar siding when a knock came at the door. I opened it to find a man in his 40s wearing a windbreaker with the HOA's logo. He looked exhausted. "I'm Marcus LeClaire," he said, "acting president of the board. I wanted to speak with you. Go on." I didn't know what Arlene was doing. None of us did. She handled filings herself and never showed full maps. "We thought your property was under the HOA like everyone else. But you never verified it," he nodded, shame in his eyes. "No. We relied on her word. We're cooperating with the DA now. Arlene's been removed from her position, officially. And the other families, we're refunding all illegitimate fines. No liens were ever processed, thankfully. We're also redrawing our charter boundaries based on the legal filings." I crossed my arms. "And me. You'll get a formal letter acknowledging your exclusion from our jurisdiction. Permanently, no more complaints, no more interference." He extended a hand. I didn't shake it. "You've got a long way to go to earn back trust." "I know," he said, lowering his arm, "but we're starting with transparency." As he walked back to his car, I looked out over the ridge. The panels were soaking in the late afternoon sun, powering everything quietly, peacefully. No HOA. No phone calls. Just the humming of my inverter and the distant cry of a hawk over the pines. The following Monday, I stood at the back of the county courtroom, arms crossed, listening as Judge Havorson called the civil fraud hearing into session. The room was packed tighter than a summer fair parking lot. Half the Briar Hills residents had shown up, some out of curiosity, others to see if the rumors were true. I caught glimpses of familiar faces, neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in months now whispering in low tones, exchanging glances across the aisle. Arlene was seated at the defendant's table, flanked by her attorney, a wiry man who looked like he hadn't slept since the Reagan administration. Her usual poise was gone. No pearls, no wedges. Just a gray blazer and the stiff posture of someone who'd finally realized the ground beneath them was giving way. Judge Havorson adjusted his glasses and looked over the filings. "We are here to determine the legitimacy of the Briar Hills Homeowners Association's jurisdictional claims, and whether board members knowingly exercised authority over parcels, not legally subject to their governance. The allegations include fraudulent collection of dues, issuing unauthorized citations, and public harassment under false pretenses." When the judge's eyes landed on Arlene, she did something I hadn't expected. She looked away. "First witness," the clerk called. Greg Ross stepped forward, holding a stack of dated letters and violation notices. His voice was steady, but the edge behind it made the room fall silent. "I received over 30 letters in 1 year," he began. "We were told our property was visually incompatible. We had to remove our vegetable garden, repaint the entire back porch, and pay a monthly fine for non-compliance. When we asked where in the bylaws any of that was written, we were told the documents were confidential." Judge Havorson raised an eyebrow. "Confidential from the homeowners. That's what we were told. Arlene handled all communications directly. If we asked questions, the response was always the same: pay the fine or face legal action." Valerie Cheng, seated at the prosecutor's table, stood. "Mr. Ross, did you ever receive a copy of the original HOA charter or the amended jurisdiction map?" "Never." "Not once." I watched as the judge made a note on his pad, then nodded toward Valerie. "Prosecution may proceed." She moved forward with the confidence of someone armed with facts and a loaded binder. "Your Honor, we have verified that Briar Hills HOA filed an incomplete jurisdictional amendment in 2008. The county never approved it. Yet, the HOA continued to issue citations, and collect dues from properties outside its lawful boundary, including the Ross property and 6 others. She laid out the original zoning map, the unfiled amendment, and the evidence from the county records office. When she reached my name, the room turned. "Mr. Oscar Tillman is not only one of the affected property owners," she said, "but also the former chair of the county planning board. He is the author of the zoning code the HOA attempted to override." My name triggered a low murmur from the crowd. A few people turned to look. I kept my arms folded and said nothing. Valerie continued. "Mr. Tillman was subject to multiple false complaints, including environmental violations, none of which were substantiated by the County Code Enforcement Division." She pointed to a signed affidavit from Officer Reyes. "These false reports were filed directly by Mrs. Ashford in her capacity as Vice President of the HOA. They were reported as urgent, triggering emergency responses, which constitutes misuse of public services." The judge held up a hand. "So, in addition to unauthorized governance, the board through Mrs. Ashford engaged in fraudulent reporting, correct?" Arlene's attorney finally stood, voice thin. "Your Honor, the board had reason to believe the amendment was in effect. There were communications with the original developer suggesting it would be approved." Judge Havorson didn't even blink. "But it never was, and no efforts were made to verify its completion. No formal efforts, no." The judge tapped his gavel once. "Then we're dealing with willful negligence at best. Continue." The next witness was a woman named Carrie Benson, a single mother who'd bought a small home near the edge of the development. Her story went deeper than citations. She'd been threatened with property seizure. "They said they'd place a lien if I didn't pay the maintenance fees," she said, voice wavering. "I was told my house would be auctioned off if I missed another payment. I didn't know they had no authority over me." Valerie held up a copy of the lien threat letter. This letter was signed by Mrs. Ashford. "The legal code cited in this document does not apply to the property in question. It was entirely fabricated." That was the final nail, and Arlene knew it. Her attorney leaned over and whispered something, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stared straight ahead, lips pressed into a tight line. The judge looked over the bench. "We will recess for 1 hour. Upon return, I will issue a provisional ruling." Outside the courthouse, I stepped into the crisp autumn air. The leaves had just started to turn, and the courthouse lawn was littered with golden flurries. Greg joined me near the steps, sipping a coffee from a paper cup. "I never expected it to unfold this fast," he said. "She overplayed her hand," I replied. "Too much pressure, not enough ground to stand on. She's going to be lucky if this stays civil." I nodded. Because we both knew what was coming next, an hour later the court reconvened. Judge Havorson wasted no time. After reviewing the evidence, this court finds that the Briar Hills Homeowners Association operated outside the limits of its legally defined jurisdiction. All actions taken against properties not covered by the original charter are hereby declared void. All collected dues, fines, and fees associated with those actions must be refunded within 60 days. Gasps echoed through the room. Arlene's face didn't move. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this court recommends that the district attorney's office pursue criminal charges against Mrs. Arlene Ashford for fraudulent misrepresentation, unauthorized governance, and misuse of emergency services." The bailiff stepped forward as the judge stood. "Mrs. Ashford, please remain seated." She stood anyway. "I didn't do anything criminal," she snapped. "I was preserving the value of our community." The bailiff didn't argue. He simply took her gently by the arm as Valerie handed over the arrest warrant. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Arlene was escorted out, her shoes clicking down the aisle in rhythm with the collapse of her authority. Outside, a cluster of residents gathered around Marcus Leclerc, who was now fumbling through a notepad, trying to explain what the board would do next. No one was listening. Someone tapped me on the shoulder. It was Shelley Ross. "You think we'll be all right now? Depends who takes over," I said. "But the illusion's broken. That matters." She gave a small nod and turned back toward the courthouse. I stayed behind for a moment, watching the last patrol car disappear down the road. 2 weeks later, I received a letter in the mail from the interim HOA board. It was a formal apology, signed by every current member. They included a check full reimbursement for the time, labor, and materials I'd documented during the harassment campaign. I sent it straight to the local volunteer fire department. By the end of the month, 5 new board members had been elected, all residents who had previously been silenced by Arlene's tactics. One of them, a retired postal worker named Lyle, stopped by my cabin with a peace offering, a bottle of homemade cider and a handwritten note that read, "No more nonsense." I thanked him, and we stood outside for a while, watching the wind spin through the trees. "You know," he said after a long pause, "there's talk of dissolving the HOA entirely. People are tired of being pushed around." I didn't say anything right away. Then I looked toward the ridge. "Let the people decide," I said. That's how it should have been from the start. And with that, the air felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because the power had shifted. And this time, it wasn't going back. The first snow came early that year, just a light dusting, but enough to coat the cabin's roof and make the solar panels gleam like polished obsidian. I was finishing the insulating on my water tank when my landline rang. Hardly anyone used it anymore, but the number was still listed on a few public records. I picked it up. Oscar, a voice I didn't recognize, answered. "Mr. Tillman, this is Detective Marissa Doyle, County Financial Crimes Unit. You have a moment." I wiped my hands on a towel. "What's going on?" "We've uncovered new evidence in the Briar Hills HOA investigation. I'd prefer to speak in person." An hour later, her unmarked sedan crunched up my driveway. She stepped out, tall and lean, wearing a fleece-lined coat and carrying 2 leather folders. Her boots left sharp prints in the snow-dusted gravel as she approached. We sat on the porch, steam rising from the mugs of black coffee I handed her. She opened the first folder. During our review of the HOA's internal correspondence, we found several documents that weren't part of the court's original discovery. Apparently, some files were stored off the HOA's main server on a private drive at Arlene Ashford's residence. "Hidden records?" I asked. "Yes." "And not just letters or meeting notes, financial ledgers, spreadsheets tracking payments from properties never under HOA jurisdiction. There are discrepancies, large ones." My stomach turned slightly. "How large?" "North of $230,000, collected over 6 years. Most of it never went through the HOA's official account." I leaned back in my chair. "You're saying she was embezzling?" "More than that, she was running a private slush fund." We traced several transfers to an entity called Community Preservation Associates. Turns out, it's not a registered business. It's a shell account she created under her maiden name. I stared at the steam rising from my mug. "She threatened people, lied about authority, and then pocketed the money." Detective Doyle nodded. "We've filed charges for grand theft, wire fraud, and falsification of legal documents. She's also being investigated for witness intimidation, stemming from a complaint filed by one of the former board members. He claims she threatened to expose personal details if he didn't go along with her." "Marcus?" I asked. She hesitated. "No, someone else. A man named Brian Eckersley. He resigned from the board in 2021. Tried to raise concerns but was shut down." I remembered Brian. Soft-spoken, rarely attended community meetings, moved out quietly a year ago. No one thought twice about it. "Is he all right?" "He's cooperating." Gave us access to archived emails Arlene sent from a private account. One of them included a scanned copy of a forged approval letter from the county planning office. She used it to convince the rest of the board the jurisdiction amendment had been finalized. "Jesus," I muttered. "She signed your name at the bottom." I looked up sharply. "What?" "On the forged letter. It bears your signature copied from an old public document. That's how she backed up her claim to board members and homeowners alike. She told them you had signed off on the boundary expansion when you left the planning board." I stood, pacing the porch. "That explains why people were so convinced. They thought the guy who wrote the code had approved her nonsense. She committed forgery. That charge alone could get her 5 years. I turned back to her. "What do you need from me?" "A formal statement confirming you never signed such a letter or authorized any boundary changes, preferably with notarized copies of your original zoning drafts." I still have the hard copies. In a locked case inside. She smiled for the first time that morning. Then let's nail this down. 2 days later, I sat in the county courthouse again, this time not in a courtroom, but in a private briefing with the DA, the detective, and a forensic accountant named Nate who looked like he hadn't seen daylight in a decade. They had whiteboards covered in flowcharts, tracing money transfers from HOA accounts to Arlene's shell company, then to her personal checking account. She used the money for home renovations, vacations in Sedona, and private security services, Nate explained. She even paid a firm out of Charleston to monitor public social media accounts of certain homeowners. Wait, I said. She was spying on people, anyone who posted about the HOA in a negative light, Doyle added. She had them flagged, including you. I shook my head. That's not just fraud. That's a surveillance campaign. Valerie, the DA, tapped her pen against the table. We're expanding the case. It's no longer just a civil fraud. We're filing for criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, identity falsification, and illegal surveillance. The charges are stacking. What's the defense saying? I asked. They're trying to argue she was acting in the community's interest, that she had verbal approval from previous officials, but the forged documents and private accounts destroy that argument. Good, I said. Because people deserve to know how deep this went. The following weekend, the county held a public forum in the Briar Hills Community Center. The turnout was massive. The air was thick with tension, but also something else: expectation. People wanted answers. They wanted accountability. Valerie stepped up to the podium, flanked by county officials and myself. I didn't want to speak, but I'd agreed to present the zoning documents, the real ones. I unrolled the original boundary map on the projector screen. This is the only legally recognized map. It was filed, stamped, and certified in 2008. No amendments were ever approved. Everything else was smoke and mirrors. I pointed to the excluded parcels. These homes, including my own, were never at any time under HOA control. Any fines, threats, or fees issued to these addresses were not just illegitimate, they were illegal. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs followed. Valerie stepped forward. We have issued a warrant for the arrest of Arlene Ashford on multiple criminal counts. Her assets have been frozen pending trial. Restitution will be pursued for every dollar misappropriated. A hand shot up in the back, a woman with graying hair and tears in her eyes. What about the board? Did they know? Some were misled, Valerie responded. Others looked the other way. We're reviewing cooperation levels and may issue further charges. Another voice called out. How do we stop this from happening again? I answered that one. Dissolve the HOA. Rebuild something from the ground up if you must, but with transparency and checks in place. And never let one person hold all the keys. After the forum, people didn't rush out. They lingered, talking, reconnecting. For the first time in years, the community wasn't divided by lawns or mailboxes. They were united by what they'd survived. 3 weeks later, the Briar Hills HOA was formally disbanded by a majority vote. The county approved the dissolution after confirming all debts were settled and no active liens remained. The HOA office was cleared out, the signage removed, and the records sealed for legal review. The cabin was quiet again. I spent the next few days clearing snow from the roof and checking the battery banks. The panels worked even in winter, just a little slower, but so much had changed. The silence was finally peace, not pressure. One morning, I found a small package at the foot of my steps. No name. Inside was a hand-carved plaque made from old barnwood. Burned into the surface in careful letters were the words, "Independent, not isolated." I mounted it above the cabin door. Not long after, I got a call from the county supervisor. They were forming a new advisory council on rural governance and zoning enforcement. They wanted someone who knew how things could go wrong and how to keep them right. I accepted, not for power, for protection. Because the moment people forget how easily control can be abused is the moment someone like Arlene finds their way back in. But not here, not again, not on my ridge.